was going to be Jim's last flight, Dave.
Let me ask this question, Jules.
Let's get Ron suited up.
Wondering, is there anything about this flight that was left undone that caused this kind of a thing, or is it something that could have happened on any of the previous flights?
Anytime between here and here.
I'm sorry, David, I couldn't hear you there.
My question was, is the difficulty that we're currently involved in on Apollo 13 something that was left undone on this flight, or is it something that could have occurred on any of the previous flights?
No, David, I can think of nothing that was left undone. There never is anything left undone. I've been bugged and a little uptight myself by the low morale I saw demonstrated at Cape Kennedy, and to a lesser extent at Houston, by workers at Pad 39 who already had pink slips in their back pocket, by people who could see Apollo coming to an end with a lack of support in Washington, and of course many, many far more important problems in space for the people of this country to conquer and worry about. But I can think of no specific thing undone. Indeed, as good friends of mine have put it who are in the program, Apollo has been a case of overkill, if you will. The program is so tremendously redundant. There are so many backup systems, so many computerized checkout systems, and so many people checking on other people that it's almost impossible to leave anything undone. This was either a meteoroid hit, as some astronomers tonight have indicated, or an unexpected metal fatigue failure in a tank. No one really knows. They're speaking opinion. Jim Lovell said it was something that appeared to be quite violent that occurred in Bay 4 of the service module, and if it were struck by a meteorite, that would be quite violent. I wouldn't say that's what's happened, McDivitt said, but I won't rule it out. Now, everything is under control at the moment. The astronauts are safe. We're not hearing very much conversation from them. But indeed, no one knows what exactly will happen in the hours that unfold. They're going to be tense hours in mission control. They're going to be tense hours in homes in Houston. And they're going to be tense hours for some men who will be very, very tired aboard Apollo 13, both in the lunar module, Aquarius, and in Odyssey, until Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert are out of the woods, as it were, and have fired up. Now, Bob Runn, our North American engineering test pilot, our house astronaut, as it were, is getting suited up here in business suit, and we should have him ready, configured for flight in a moment or two. And Bob's been doing what we would call some abort analysis work to help us out on this complex trajectory involved to get them back. And Bob caught me with my slide rule up, down, or sideways, as the case may be, and commented that they don't need the APS, or the Ascent Propulsion System engine, to get themselves out of lunar orbit. They can do it with the DIPS engine alone, the descent engine. Bob, do you have that chart there, the abort line chart you were indicating earlier?
I have it over on my desk if you... For this particular type of emergency, this is what they call a Mode 1 emergency, and right at the very beginning of the burn, all they have to have is just the descent propulsion system to enable them to speed up and correct their trajectory back to the Earth. The APS engine and the DIPS engine is only used in conjunction in the event that they went into lunar orbit and they lost their Soviet propulsion system engine sometime after it had been running for about 40 seconds. But on this particular emergency, all they have to rely on is just their descent propulsion system.
Right, but are they going to be able to do this with one burn, Bob, or two?
No, just one. One is all that's needed. It's just a short burn.
Have you heard the numbers on the burn? How much power is needed?
I did hear Chris Kraft mention the number, and I think it was around 30 to 40 feet per second. So it's not much of a burn at all to accelerate them back and put them back on the correct trajectory for an Earth landing.
Well, we started to ask the question to Chris over the line to Houston, then he felt he had a dash back to mission control.
Because if you remember, Chris, Jules, they did have a mid-course correct trajectory burn, which put them on this hybrid mission, and it was just a short burn, if you remember.
Right, right.
So this is just a short burn on the DPS engine.
To round out the mission, to get us out of a hybrid trajectory and back into a free return trajectory.
Absolutely.
All right, so what you're saying is that once we do the maneuver getting us back to a free return trajectory, they can, in effect, do what Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders could have done aboard Apollo 8, which is make it back free with no gas needed.
Precisely.
Cruise all the way back.
So it is just a short burn on the DPS.
Well, then
engine.
we're in good shape because
Right.
the 40 feet per second that would be needed, that's you can get outside and paddle hard and practically do that on your own. It's a very
I'm sure
small
the crew
burn.
could probably do that.
And at this point, they're about ready to. Backpacks or not, Bob.
And this is one other alternative that they have. They have their Pliss backpacks that they can use too. So they're not in a critical situation, but they're still in good shape.
Right. When this evening of emergencies began, for us about 4 hours ago, Jim Lovell, when we last saw him, was crawling back into the command module from Aquarius, the lunar module, after having safely checked it out. Seconds later, moments later, the emergency took place. Let's replay that tape now.
Odyssey as we slide on through the tunnel here.
We're seeing Jim Lovell there floating upside down after he came back into the Odyssey command module. He had been in a gay mood. You'll shortly see, if we can get our monitors clear here, so we can see too. Lovell smiling. That's an excellent close-up shot of him. Relaxed and happy. Just about 10 minutes later, the emergency struck. The loud bang in the service module's Bay 4 when the fuel cell fuel tanks blew out. And then what had been an uneventful mission turned into one of near tragedy, turned into a real emergency. This videotape replay we're seeing took place at about 9:45. Let's hear a little bit of what Jim Lovell was saying then.
Fred's couch in the command module right now, where we stood it temporarily while we're checking out the Aquarius. And underneath his couch, we've got the probe stowed, quite a big cumbersome device. And we'll get a shot of it for you. You're looking now at our probe that we place on the nose of Odyssey. It's a very heavy thing, but of course in zero gravity it weighs nothing and it's much easier to move around. As a matter of fact, both Fred and Jack commented, as many people in the past have, of how much.
And we're now hearing a very important air-to-ground communication from Mission Control. That free return burn maneuver will be done some 16 minutes from now at 61 hours in the mission. Let's go to Mission Control for this air-to-ground. It's a 16-foot-per-second burn.
Roger, we're working up a pad for it, but we'd want to know what you think about doing it at that time.
Well, we'll do it. Can you give us a little bit more time?
And you missed a little bit of that due to some line difficulties from Houston. That's Jim Lovell asking for a few minutes more time. Capcom was telling him they have to do that free return burn in 37 minutes from now. Water is now critical. The water supply in the LEM has now become critical, and they must do the 16-foot-per-second burn. Let's go back to air-to-ground.
Just a time from you. We can figure out a free return maneuver for any time you want to give us. So if you'll give us the time you'd like to shoot for, we'll figure out a pad.
Okay, that sounds good. I think if we have a little bit more time, we want to do it right. Stand by one.
And that was...
Let's shoot for an hour if we can, Jack, on that.
Okay, Jim, how about 61 hours and 30
That's,
minutes? That's an hour and 5 from now.
That was Jim Lovell talking to Capcom, Jim asking for an hour more time to get ready for the burn. Mission Control agreeing at 61 hours and 30 minutes, or an hour and 5 minutes from now, that burn, that free return trajectory burn, to get them back to that trajectory must be increased. Let's get some more air to ground now.
That we have a radar and a landing radar heater breaker, and can I pull those out?
Affirmative, pull them both out. And now we want to ask you a question about alignments and so forth. We wanted to know if you can see any stars out of the AOT. We also wanted to know if you could use the service module to cast a shadow on the limb windows and then look out the windows to see stars for P-51, COAS alignment.
Okay, in this attitude, Jack, that we're pitching around, I cannot use the AOT to see stars. We're just not able to see them at all. Now, we may be able to maneuver off and yaw, or roll and see stars. Right now, we haven't been able to. The AOT is useless. The command module structure is just radiating too much light into the telescope.
Okay, and how about using the service module to cast a shadow on the commander's window? If you do that, can you see stars for COAS alignment?
We can give that a try, Jack, although I don't know how successful it will be. We try to do it. The light shines off our quads, which makes it difficult to see stars. We do have the Earth and Moon, if that could be of assistance. Another problem right now, Jack, I'm looking out the right window, and it's pretty dark out that window, but there are about 1,000 or so false stars out here from leftover from some of the debris. It's hard to discern what's real and not real.
Okay, that's good information, and during the time that we see your continuing to pitch, if you ever get in a position where you think the AOT might be of some use, we'd like you to periodically look out of it and see if you can see some stars that would enable us to get a P-52.
Okay, will do. And also, let me ask you a question. In this configuration, Doc, we have to use the TTCA to control pitch and roll. And just how much can we use that without really changing our trajectory? We only have 60 miles to play with.
Roger, we'll put that to him.
Okay, Jack, are you ready to go to work with me on the 2-hour DIPS activation and contingency book page 1?
Roger, we're ready to go.
Okay, item 1, we can, 1 through 5, we can scratch off as done. Is that correct?
Stand by one, Fred.
Yeah, Bob, see. The air-to-ground communication somewhat sparse there at the end, as you heard Spacecraft Commander Jim Lovell agree to this burn an hour and 5 minutes from about 7 minutes ago, or a little less than an hour from now, about 58 minutes from now, at around 3:45 p.m. 3:45 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we can hear in some of the circuits Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert working with Capcom Jack Lausma, getting set up for the burn, getting new state vectors, new factors for their computer to do the burn, which we're going to show you now on our telestrator exactly what is going to happen now that a clear course of action has been agreed upon by Mission Control. Let's put ourselves on the telestrator here and let's first put in a moon up here, and looking at it from the pilot's eye point of view, a smaller Earth here. We'll call that Earth, and we'll call that moon right there. After launching from the Earth, they got about 5/6 of the way to within about 40,000 miles of the moon, when at around 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time tonight the emergency took place. The orbit they were on would have carried them on along. We're going to erase for perspective here to show you better what it would look like. There's the moon. The orbit they were on when the emergency took place here would have carried them on this hybrid trajectory on a long, long loop behind the moon if they hadn't been able to do anything and couldn't have done the lunar orbit insertion burn that had been scheduled for tomorrow night, which now cannot take place. That would have left them definitely lost in space, far, far out. What they're going to do now, to show you again with a fresh drawing, here's the moon, and here's where we were when the emergency took place. They're going to swing up, and in about an hour from now, they're going to do a very small burn of 16 feet per second to get rid of this hybrid trajectory that would have carried them far behind the moon and put them on a free return trajectory exactly as Apollo 8 and 10 were on. A free return trajectory that in fact glides them back to Earth down this way with no extra power required. Then, using no engine power at all, they can get back, and here's what the situation will look like. Earth here. Moon. Flight course to point here, X, where the emergency took place. Free return trajectory burned an hour from now. Swings them around the backside of the moon like this, and back after about a 60-hour journey. The time is still being worked out. In a figure-8 maneuver to a landing, hopefully abeam the MPL, the Mid-Pacific Line, at about 1:30 p.m. Friday afternoon. The Atlantic recovery, which would have carried them to here, is still being debated, but Mission Control does not want to do it unless the emergency worsens. So there, with our telestrator device and a light pen, we can show you exactly what will take place shortly. They are making the best of a very bad and very dangerous situation. All does seem to be going reasonably well at the moment, as well as can. Friends have rushed to the homes of the homes of astronauts Lovell and Hayes to be with their families. Astronaut Pete Conrad, the command pilot of Apollo 12, his wife Jane, and the Reverend Donald Raish, pastor of the LaPorte Episcopal Church, who were among those at the Lovell house, we're told, and astronaut Al Bean arrived at the Hayes house shortly after the trouble developed. And Marilyn Lovell is quoted as saying her only concern now, as is ours and everyone else's, is their safe return. Let's go back to Dave Snell now.
Well, Jules, we've been hearing a lot about what is happening up in space, but of course the big story here in Houston right now, aside from the one at Mission Control, is what are, in fact, the wives of the two astronauts who have wives, James Lovell and Fred Hayes, doing at this hour. As you've just reported, their friends have gathered around. In fact, they have gathered around to such an extent that they have had to bring out the police and cordon off the area so that only the friends get into the area where the wives live. They, earlier in the evening, were over at the Mission Control. They watched the television pass and left very excited about the whole thing, only to get a call a little while later from NASA that something had gone wrong. Since it did go wrong, the friends gathered in, and about all they can all do now is wait. The report now is much better, of course, than it was a little while ago, and naturally, for both of them, as for the rest of us, the safe return of the astronauts is the #1 item.
Right, Dave. That, of course, is the #1 concern of all of us, too, and indeed, I think people all over the world. the first real emergency ever to have taken place on an Apollo manned spaceflight.
Well, if you...
First real emergency, as we say, ever to have taken place on an Apollo manned spaceflight. It happened some 56 hours GET, or ground elapsed time, at about 10 p.m. tonight, and it was touch and go there for an hour as to what would happen. We almost did have 3 astronauts lost in space. But as we've been recapping for you, there'll be a short burn of the descent propulsion system engine, a very small 16-foot per second burn, at about 50 minutes from now, that will get them back on a free return trajectory that should bring them back to Earth sometime Friday afternoon. Let's go to Mission Control now and pool correspondent Roy Neal.
Okay, deep Slayton, DE, JE, SOA, CYON.
The astronauts in space are now talking to Jack Lausma in Mission Control, and what they're talking about is making sure that in their rapid motion to turn on the lunar module, Aquarius, that they did it correctly. They're running down the checklist for LEM activation, as they call it. In addition to this, the flight controllers are dictating some corrections as they go. Corrections primarily dictated here because of the need to conserve power. As Lausma talks, we hear these corrections coming through, and we hear him making them to the astronauts. It might be pointed out also that the burn coming up is not to replace the major burn for home, but instead is intended to give the astronauts what they call a free return trajectory. In short, a trajectory that would not allow them to be captured by the lunar gravity, to give them some leeway in this situation. It will not replace the main burn. We still expect that coming up at about 79 hours and 25 minutes. But very shortly now, at 61 hours and 30 minutes approximately, less than an hour from now, they will make a burn of about 16 feet per second, and that should give them a trajectory that will not allow them to be captured by the moon. Much conversation going on between the astronauts and the flight controllers being relayed through Lausma. The mission control room itself, still a busy place, still filled with people, anxious people working out the systems so that Apollo 13 can be brought safely back to Earth. Roy Neal in Mission Control.
And that was pool correspondent Roy Neal from Mission Control, saying in effect that in addition to the small 16-foot per second burn to get Apollo 13 and its astronauts back on a free return trajectory, they would still have to do a big burn tomorrow night. The situation is somewhat confused. Our last word from Houston, from the Manned Spacecraft Center, is that that big burn will not be necessary and will most likely not be attempted in the hope of conserving the electrical supply aboard the LEM. The free return burn, as we'll call it, that gets them back on, to a trajectory that'll carry them back to Earth on a glide, if you will be attempted in some 45 to 50 minutes from now. Let's get an idea of what the latest was as we play back part of the press conference with Chris Kraft and Jim McDivitt that took place less than an hour ago. By videotape, back to the Mission Control Center.
How much electrical lifetime do we have in the LEM, and how much oxygen lifetime? How long do we have?
Well, Mark, it depends upon how we use it, obviously. We have 4 batteries in the descent stage of the LEM with 400 amp hours each. We have 2 batteries in the ascent stage with 296 amp hours each.
Well, we have our little problems, too, including videotape machines, and hundreds of people have been called out in the middle of the night to deal with this emergency. And among those hundreds of people are North American house astronaut Bob Rahn, who's going to untangle himself from 5 different phones shortly and 16 different headsets and put on the headset that counts, namely our Pacific Plantronics headset, the same one used aboard the command module. Come on, Bob, you ought to know how to put that on.
Go ahead.
You don't need the headset, Bob.
All right.
The microphone.
Go ahead, Jules.
Will this burn, the 16 FPS burn, a foot per second burn, Bob, really get them out of lunar orbit okay without any other burn?
I believe it will, because they made a hybrid burn with the SPS engine here the other day to put them on this hybrid trajectory, and now all they got to do now is burn the DPS engine now to get them into a free return. And to my knowledge, I don't think that there is any other requirement for another big DPS burn.
Right, we don't think so either. Have you been able to get any further handle, Bob, on what was causing the oxygen leakage in the command module, and has it been stopped? How much oxygen is left? Jim McDivitt in the news conference referred to the fact As you recall, they had charged the surge and emergency tanks for reentry and had a good 6 or 7 hours of oxygen in them. But have you been able to get any handle on what was causing the leak?
No, I haven't, Jules. I haven't heard a thing, and I'm sure that when the information is available, that it will come out through Mission Control. The people down there, they have all the telemetry, and they are studying this information and data. And as soon as it's available, I'm sure it will be. They'll let us know. But to this point, why, your guess is as good as mine as to what causes the oxygen leak.
You know, I used to hear you and Dick Sprague, our Grumman consulting pilot, kid each other about the capability of the LEM and the fact that the LEM's descent propulsion system engines were a backup system for the command module engines. We never thought it would ever come to this.
That's true, and Dick Sprague has always kidded me about being about the command module being the transportation system for the LEM. Well, it's the other way around now. The LEM is being the transportation system for the command module, and we're mighty fortunate to have the LEM attached.
Right, and as we heard Capcom label it a few hours ago, the LEM, Aquarius, the name Jim Lovell gave it, has become the lifeboat, Bob, in this mission. And they're going to fly in that lifeboat, if we make our guess correctly, all the way back almost to Earth and separate from the LEM, get back into the command module just before reentry. Is that the way you understand it?
That's right. They'll carry the DPS or the LEM vehicle until they get back into Earth entry, and then they'll go ahead and make the normal separation of the service module and the DPS, which will be attached at the time, and go ahead and make a normal entry.
And, of course, one point that should be made is that the command module, as you put it to me a short time ago, Bob, the command module itself, it's, well, here's our model here. The command module's hull or fuselage, depending on your naval or aeronautic point of view, has not been impinged or damaged, as far as we know, by this accident in the service module. And the command module is still perfectly re-entry worthy, to coin a phrase.
That's right, Jules.
You've heard no evidence to the contrary.
I haven't heard a thing. The command module is still shipworthy, and I'm sure that from all the information that we have, that when it comes time to make an Earth entry, that the command module and its systems is capable of making a normal entry.
Right, so the configuration would look a little bit like this, with Lovell and Hayes flying in the Aquarius lunar module here, and Jack Swigert flying in the Odyssey command module. They'll limp their way back to Earth, to put it one way, then separate from the lunar module, perhaps 15 or 20,000 miles out from Earth, discard it, and it'll burn up in reentry, of course. And then all three men will be in the Apollo command module, and they'll do some small burns with the RCS, the reaction control system thrusters here if they need to. That'll line them up for a reentry. Of course, they can reenter, Bob, as I recall, even without the RCS system if they have to. They may skip over their landing area a little bit, but they will make it down safely. Do you agree? I've put you in...
I think they could... I think you did put me on the spot there. I have to think about that question for a while.
I traded off a question unfairly. It is my knowledge from many hours of what used to seem to me in my management boring simulations in Houston, and unnecessary simulations in some case, that after discarding and separating from the service module, the command module, even without its RCS system thrusters, has the capability to skip back into the Earth orbit with no RCS thrusters to correct it. You may not land where you want to, at exactly the right point in the Pacific or the Atlantic, if that's the landing area chosen. You will make it back without buying the farm. You will make it back safely. Thank you, Bob. Let's again try that news conference tape a short time ago with Chris Kraft and Jim McDivitt, the one we had some problems with, and let's hope we can get it fired up correctly. Chris Kraft, Jim McDivitt, Sig Schoberg at the Manned Spacecraft Center.
How much electrical lifetime do we have in the LEM, and how much oxygen lifetime? How long do we have?
Well, Mark, it depends upon how we use it, obviously. We have 4 batteries in the descent stage of the LEM with 400 amp hours each. We have 2 batteries in the ascent stage with 296 amp hours each. If you rough that out quickly, it says we can use power at about 25 amps. steady state current until we get back. Now, we'll have to arrange the electrical profile so that we can bring up the systems to perform the dock DPS maneuver, and then we'll power down to minimum levels and go along like that. When I left, we had an ample power supply to do the whole mission, but we were still roughing it out and trying to get in a configuration which we knew. Oxygen, we have 48 pounds of oxygen in the LEM descent tanks, which is more than adequate to do the mission. We also have a couple pounds in the LEM ascent tanks. I think I said descent. Descent tank has 48 pounds. The ascent tanks have about a pound or so each.
Point out that we have locked up the CSM systems to preserve that spacecraft for reentry, both in terms of power and oxygen. So it is sufficient to support entry.
The command module is completely intact. There's no problem with it at all.
I wonder if we can expand a little more on the possibility of an Atlantic Ocean landing and what the recovery posture is for the Atlantic.
For an Atlantic landing, we would have airplanes with parajumpers on the scene at the time of landing. We're presently surveying that area of the Atlantic. It's, as I remember, it's about 20 or 25 degrees south and about, I think it's about 25 or 30 degrees west longitude. And we're presently surveying the area for ships of opportunity. But we do not have a planned recovery ship in that area, as you know.
So would you, let me follow up on that. Would you say that now it seems a great deal more likely that you'd go for 142 hours and the Pacific, where you have a recovery capability?
I think that's a good possibility, but I'd like to reserve judgment until I see what happens in the next hours. We have some 18 or 19 hours until that burn has to be made, so I think we'd certainly be watching the situation. The Pacific is a lot better from the standpoint that we have the ship there. It's better from a network standpoint, so it's a preferred place, even though it might take a little longer.
Chris or Jim, can you tell us where the 3 astronauts are and how they will be living in their return to Earth?
Well, when I left, I think that Jack Swigert was still in the command module and Jim and Fred were in the LEM. And I think that they'll be living between the 2 spacecraft until they return. Sometime before reentry, of course, the 3 of them will return to the command module and put the hatch back in and jettison the LEM, jettison the service module.
If I were going to guess, I'd guess that the 2 of them would sleep in the CSM while the other one stayed awake in the LEM. I would guess that they'll probably go to some kind of shift like that.
Yeah.
And I followed up, how are they going to be getting oxygen and heat in the command module? From the LEM?
We're going to be running one environmental control system or the other. Initially, we'll be running the LEM system. That's what we're running right now. Now, intermittently, we'll run the CSM system to make sure that we keep the atmosphere in the LEM free of carbon dioxide. So we'll be alternating. That's why I say there'll be people in both spacecraft.
Let's take some over here, then we'll come back on this far side. Right there, yeah.
Yeah, will somebody explain to me what you mean by a ship of opportunity in the Atlantic? Is that some merchant ship or Russian sub that happens to be
It could be a merchant ship. It could be, I suppose it could be a foreign nation's naval vessel. Any of that kind of thing.
You mean any ship in the area?
Yes, sir. Right here.
Chris, has this abort situation or altered trajectory ever been run on simulators in just this way?
Oh, yes. Many times. We run all kinds of abort situations. And if you recall, in Colonel McDivitt's flight, we actually burned the DIPS engine attached to the command and service module. The autopilot in the lunar module is designed to carry out the maneuver under those circumstances. That is, the digital autopilot to damp the oscillations of the combined spacecraft. We are looking even at the possibilities of dropping the service module, but that particular type of maneuver has not been tested in flight, and we'd have to make ourselves certain that we could control the spacecraft under that kind of CG and inertia conditions. So that's kind of unlikely that we would do that. If we did that, it would give us that much more delta V, you see, because we'd get rid of quite a bit of weight from the CSM.
Zach Strickland?
We pause now 5 seconds so our stations can identify themselves. This is Jules Bergman at ABC Space Headquarters again in New York at 61 hours and 15 minutes into the flight of Apollo 13, a flight that until 5 hours and 20 minutes ago had been going smoothly when quite literally all hell broke loose in the Apollo 13 spacecraft. Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes, after inspecting the Aquarius lunar module, had just crawled back into their Odyssey command module when they heard a loud bang and lost 2 of their 3 fuel cells, the fuel cells that supply them electrical power. They began losing oxygen as well out of the spacecraft, and very shortly they were ordered to bail out, as it were, to get out of the Odyssey command module, which was then losing all electrical power. Jack Swigert, the command module pilot, stayed in Odyssey, monitoring its systems, while Lovell and Hayes crawled into Aquarius, their lunar module, activated all its systems, and indeed, that's where they are now at this moment in this trouble-ridden flight. For a short time, it appeared that the lives of the astronauts themselves were in danger, and they're by no means out of danger. But things seem to be somewhat more under control. The facts as they stand now are these. Aquarius and Odyssey, our 3 astronauts, are now 212,000 statute miles out from Earth, less than 28,000 miles from what had been their target, the Moon. They're burning up there at a speed of 2,200 miles an hour. We should say coasting along at a speed of 2,200 miles an hour. And some 40 minutes from now, they'll do a short burn of the LEMS descent engine. Remember, the service propulsion engine of the command module is crippled because there's no electricity to fire it up. They'll do a short burn, a small burn of the LEMS engine, to put them back into a free return trajectory that'll head them safely back to Earth with a landing roughly calculated, it can be no better than roughly at this point, early Friday afternoon, about 1:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Standing by at ABC Space Headquarters in Houston at the Mission Control Center, ABC's Dave Snell. Dave, the lights indeed are burning late. What's going on there?
Well, Jules, what is going on here, of course, is trying to evaluate all the data which is coming from the spaceship and to determine just how they're going to bring it back to a safe landing here on Earth. It occurs to me, Jules, we were talking a little bit earlier about the decreasing morale that we have both witnessed, both here and at Cape Kennedy, a continued professionalism, but a slightly lowering of the morale of the people who work here, and of course some of them have been cut off as the congressional appropriations have gone down. Now there are another couple of decreasing things. One is decreasing public interest in the space program, I think since Apollo 11, and the other one is, as I've just said, the decrease in the congressional appropriations. I'm curious to get your reading as to just what this kind of a event might do to future space program. Are we going to, we're certainly going to see an increase in interest tomorrow. It's going to be a very big headline item, and a number of people are staying up late to watch what is happening tonight and are going to be very, very interested in to see how the whole thing comes out, and praying and hoping that the astronauts will come out all right. But I'm curious to know what will be the impact on the space program per se. What do you think?
Dave, at 3 o'clock in the morning Eastern Time or 2 o'clock in the morning Central Time, it's pretty hard to be a seer, much less much of a prophet. But as you say, unquestionably, public interest will pick up. There will be tremendous newspaper headlines. There will be congressional calls for an investigation, as there was after the Apollo 1 or 204 fire some 3 years ago. It seems like 30 years ago at this point. I think we'll all take space a little less complacently. We'll all not assume as many things as we do about it. An inherently dangerous business. The space agency, as you know, itself was in the process of beginning to cut short the Apollo lunar landing program. They'd canceled Apollo 20, put it into the Skylab space station program. They were all but ready to cancel Apollo 19 and 18. We may see changes in that now. Many people in Houston, including Chris Kraft, an old friend of ours, felt the scientific return from the lunar missions wasn't worth the risk, and that the boosters, the Saturn V, and the spacecraft should be used for Earth space station exploration vehicles, if you were. I think we're going to see a long, hard look at where this nation has to go in space, as well as at the risks. The space agency is plunging ahead with studies on a space shuttle which could carry up to 50 men for long-duration Earth orbit flights, and a space shuttle, a booster, and shuttle vehicle to get them up and down. I think we're going to see long and stringent and hard looks at safety standards and can the average man ride in space. And we came so very close to losing 3 men on this mission, and we're still not away from losing them, David. What's your reaction to that?
Well, of course, that is true. It seems that here at Mission Control, a lot of people that I've talked to in the last couple of days at the Manned Spacecraft Center have been as much concerned with where they might be moved by NASA. These are the people who are high enough up that they're pretty sure that they're not going to be cut out of the program. They're wondering, well, would they really like to live in Alabama or down at Cape Kennedy if they divide up the activities here? They've been more concerned with that, perhaps, some of them, than with the flight itself. I'm not implying, I don't mean to imply any letdown at Mission Control. Certainly that isn't implied in what we are seeing from outer space, and certainly the men that we're seeing on the screen here now are very professional and have given every indication that they are on the ball here in the last few hours when it has been very important to be on the ball. On the other hand, it seems that these men, having families as they do, I checked through the data the other day, the biographical data, and found out that of the 53 men that had submitted their biographical information to the Public Affairs Office, they have a total of 93 children among them. Well, now this means we have family men, like you and I and like the rest of us, who are concerned with what is going to be their future. And if the congressional appropriations are going to be cut down, well, then they're going to be looking for some other direction to go for their careers, to feed their families and to feed their own career aspirations. I'm wondering if that isn't another aspect that will be very much in evidence here in the next month or so.
Right. Well, Dave, that is all true, and indeed, only a few weeks ago, Jack Swigert, who didn't expect to fly this mission, who would have flown an Apollo 16 some 2 years from now at the earliest, was saying to me, will I ever fly? Scientist astronaut Jack Schmitt has said the same thing, and you have 53 high-pitched, aggressive, highly trained astronauts who feel their test pilot careers in the Air Force, Navy, Marines, their careers as space agency research pilots, could have been advancing while they've been, as you put it, flying simulators and waiting for space missions, of which there are fewer and fewer. From a launch schedule of a flight every 2 months, of course, NASA's cut back to 1 flight every 6 months. There are going to be some long looks taken by a lot of the astronauts as to how many years of their lives they're willing to devote to any given thing, whatever it may be. How many years does it take you until you fly? And is it worth, as Frank Borman has put it, all that it takes out of you? We've cranked up in our audio control center here the audio tape from Jim Lovell of the actual emergencies that took place. Let's punch up that tape now and hear it.
Okay, Houston, we've had a problem here.
This is Houston. Say again, please.
Houston, we've had a problem. We've had a main beam bus undervolt.
Okay, stand by, 13. We're looking at it.
Okay, right now, Houston, the voltage is looking good. And we hit a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there.
We said Jim Lovell. That was mostly Fred Hayes' voice there. We heard reporting the emergency, the loud bang, as they put it, and then Jack Swigert. So that's the way it stands now with Apollo 13, some 213,000 miles out from Earth. We're amused by, ironically amused by, Ken Mattingly, who was to have flown this mission, who has said because he's lost many flights in the past, and when things look blackest, they turn out the best. Let's hope they do. And let's go now to pool correspondent Roy Neal at Mission Control in Houston.
It's now well after 2 o'clock in the morning here in Houston, and the faces in Mission Control are beginning to look a little drawn and gray. For more than 3 hours, these men have been under the tremendous pressure of trying to put Apollo 13 back together again, of figuring out what to do to bring it home. At the moment in Mission Control, up on the executive row of consoles, Dr. Robert Gilruth, the center director, and Christopher Kraft, his right-hand man, are sitting. They're accompanied by some of the top officials, Dale Meyer, director of manned spaceflight from NASA headquarters, and others. The center of activity is the flight director's position, where at the moment Glenn Lunny and two other flight directors, Jerry Griffin and Milton Windler, are running the operation, checking all points to see what can be done to best advantage to correct situations as they develop. And up on astronauts row at the capsule communicator's position, Jack Lausma is the voice that we hear, but he's surrounded by Donald K. Slayton, director of the astronaut's office, astronaut John Young, Tom Stafford, associate director of that office, and others who have been moving into and out of the room through the night. At all console positions, we see 2 and 3 men respectively, and it's been this way all evening. All hands showed up as if by magic shortly after the trouble developed, and ever since the problem has been one of what can they do? Still working out the problems, and now just about 30 minutes away from a burn that will put the spacecraft on a free return trajectory, one that would bring it home under any circumstances. Roy Neal in Mission Control.
And this is Jules Bergman back at ABC Space Headquarters, some 61 hours and 20 minutes into this trouble-ridden Apollo 13 flight, where the emergency that developed some 6 hours ago is still being dealt with. We're around 20 minutes away from this burn, this small burn of the lunar module's descent propulsion system engine, intended to put Apollo 13 back onto a free return trajectory to get Lovell, Hayes, and Swigert safely back to Earth, out of the hybrid trajectory they're now on, which would send them looping out far behind the moon and be the end of the ball game. And we've been listening to, on the air-to-ground conversation, in the background, the radio from the spacecraft to Mission Control and to our headset here. Much technical talk with state vectors, which are position vectors for the computer, if you will, and inertial position vectors and details, being radioed up to the astronauts from Capcom, Jack Lausma in Mission Control. They're reading off ECS, environmental control system quantities, battery power, the final figures being radioed up for their computer, the LEM's onboard computer, as well as the command module's onboard computer. This maneuver has to work. If it doesn't work, there's almost no place else to go. And as most of you are aware, there is no rescue possible in spaceflight. Any rescue system, the space agency, has long since calculated, any rescue system the space agency calculated would have cost more than $1 billion a year, a prohibitive cost. And the ones who argued most vehemently against a rescue system are the astronauts themselves, who have contended to me for many, many years that the risks are well within tolerance. The risks, as you heard Jim Lovell say a little bit earlier in that film interview we did a month or so ago with him, the risks are smaller than those of a combat pilot in Vietnam. The risks are smaller than many of their colleagues take. The risks seem to be smaller than headsets falling off you at 3:30 in the morning. They're now rating up the final figures for their onboard computers, and as we said, this maneuver has to work. No rescue is possible. If this maneuver fails, they perhaps will be trapped. This is what you might call, the insurance burn. The insurance burn of their rocket engine. It has to get them out of the lunar orbit they'd be headed toward. The LEM itself was the final engine to back up the service propulsion system engine of the Apollo command module, an engine that from all signs still would be workable if it had electrical power to ignite it. The situation is exactly analogous as it would be to turning the key in your ignition on your car and finding your battery was dead, although you had a full tank of gas for the engine. Well, the LEM's engine in this case is in effect having a second engine and second battery source, a second electrical source, to fire up its engine to give your car a tow and get you headed the way you want. That's the way it stands as of now. There have been, of course, what we laymen might call some very frightening moments in our space program. Most recently, of course, would be the 2 bolts of lightning that struck Apollo 12 last November as it lifted off from Cape Kennedy. Do astronauts, with all their test pilot experience, become fearful in such situations? That was the question I put to Fred Hayes last month.
Well, I'm not sure how you equate fear versus, I think anybody that has emergencies has a few short moments of
shock, if you will, where whatever happens, it takes time to sink in and to react to. And normally you're so involved with trying to rectify whatever situation you find yourself in that you really don't too much think about the consequences at the time. It's normally after the fact that you get to sit down and really think about what did happen.
You end up trembling afterward.
Particularly if you've broken something and you have to go face the boss.
That was astronaut lunar module pilot Fred Hayes, who even now is in the Aquarius lunar module with both vehicles docked. Let's see if we can get that lined up right. We really ought to know how to do this kind of thing better after all these years. Both vehicles are docked at a position some 214,000 miles from Earth, about 26,000 miles from the moon, from the lunar landing that should have been their target if all had gone well. And a few moments from now, about 10 or 15 minutes from now, if we calculate correctly, they'll do a small burn of this engine, the descent propulsion system engine of the LEM. Since they can't use this engine, the service propulsion system engine of the command module, it has no electrical power, they'll do a small burn of this engine. The SPS engine is disabled, as it were. A 16-foot per second burn that will round out their orbit. Instead of their looping high out far away from the moon, perhaps never to make it back, that burn is intended to put them into a free return trajectory, a burn of some 60 nautical miles around the moon that will automatically get them back to Earth this Friday. They'll be gliding back, as it were, with no extra power needed. And provided the oxygen supply aboard the lunar module holds out, remember they've lost a lot of the oxygen supply aboard the Odyssey command module. Provided the oxygen supply holds out aboard the Aquarius lunar module, they should make it back to Earth safely sometime Friday afternoon, shortly after 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. ABC correspondent Jim Burns, also manning the guns, as it were, here in our ABC Space Center. Jim?
Well, Jules, I was rudely awakened, like a lot of other Americans, I imagine will be, just about 2 hours ago in Connecticut after having come back from Houston. And I was appalled to hear that they had this kind of problem. I tried to pick up the ABC radio on the way in the car and heard Red Muller and some people talking, and they gave me a fairly clear idea of what's going on. But let's assume that somebody is just waking up now and they're getting ready to go to work and they turn the radio on. Can you give us in capsule summary, give me in capsule summary, what has happened up here?
Okay, I think we can do that, Jim. At around 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, some 5 hours and 20 minutes ago, though it seems like 50 years ago, Jim, Fred Hayes and Jim Lovell, I crossed Jim Lovell's name with yours, were crawling back into the Odyssey command module after having tested out the helium system aboard the Aquarius lunar module, which was working perfectly. They had barely gotten back into the command module when they heard what Jim Lovell called a loud bang. 2 of the 3 fuel cells that supply the basic electrical power for the command module failed. The gauges went zilch, down to 0, or zip as somebody called it. Simultaneously, they began losing oxygen supply, which is still unexplained, but apparently a meteoroid or an explosion. A meteoroid hit the service module. We'll show that again, I think it's useful. The service module back there, that's the tank truck for the command module where the men are up here. In here are spherical fuel tanks, spherical oxygen containers. This is all the goodies that keep you going, the consumables, as they call it in spaceflight. Either an explosion took place in here or a meteorite came zapping through and punctured the thin aluminum skin of the service module and blew up one of those tanks. And in fact, in blowing up one of the fuel cell fuel tanks, apparently also damaged and caused a leak in one of the oxygen tanks, or ruptured a line. We'll never know, since this vehicle never gets back to Earth. It burns up. Okay, very rapidly the electrical power began failing, the oxygen supply began bleeding out of the command module, and an all-out emergency was declared. Any idea of a lunar flight, a lunar landing as originally intended in the Frau Maro area of the moon was immediately abandoned. The issue then was to save the lives of all 3 men. They were ordered to get in the lunar module, which is not here, it's over here. They were ordered to get into Aquarius, their lunar module, which, and of course, the 2 vehicles are docked, but our 2 models aren't docking too well tonight. They were ordered to get into the Aquarius lunar module and power up its system, and indeed, that's what Jim Lovell, who is in this area, the commander's left seat area of the lunar module, that's where he is now, and Fred Hayes is in the right area here. Both those men are in there now. They've got the lunar module working fine. Its engine seems to be working fine. The situation stabilized. Jack Swigert, the command module pilot, stayed in the Odyssey command module. The tunnel between both vehicles, and there's the tunnel area of the LEM, is open. In fact, the LEM's oxygen is keeping Jack in the command module here alive. But the command module's oxygen purification system has taken the carbon dioxide out of the air because the LEM system isn't yet working. They didn't have time to power it up. Now, the issue then was what to do to get them headed back toward Earth, because the service propulsion system engine, like here, is crippled. It can't be ignited. So the LEM's descent engine system that should have landed them on the moon is being utilized as an insurance engine. It's going to do a small burn in a few minutes and round out this crazy hybrid orbit they were in that would have given them better lunar lighting and a better arrival time. It's going to round it out and put them into what I call a Frank Borman style free-return trajectory orbit, and they'll glide them back to Earth, Jim.
Jules, what would you guess it was like in that capsule when that thing took place, whatever it was, when that loud noise took place? What actually happened? Did the lights suddenly go out? Things started...
Oh, the master, we know a little bit. I heard Jim Lovell say the whole thing has gone crazy. The master alarm system lit up like a Christmas tree, red lights, yellow lights, warning lights, and things like that. They knew they were in deep trouble almost instinctively. And then by punching up other things in the computer, they could read out the fuel cells and electrical power and oxygen, and that's when they knew the ball game was over. The issue then was if you were in a jet airplane, eject as fast as you can. But as Bob Braun noted earlier, even though things happen just as fast in a spacecraft, you can't get back as fast as you can by ejecting from an aircraft. You're stuck in the vehicle.
Well, was there a mad scramble to get into the LEM then?
Oh, no, they stayed there, and Mission Control in Houston, of course, which has telemetry, that in point of fact shows them the same things the guys read on the gauges inside the command module Aquarius. Mission Control knew instantly what was happening and told them, and they cross-corroborated one another's instrument readings, if you were. But within half an hour, it was obvious all command module electricity was being lost. And Jack Lausma, who was the Capcom on orders from the flight director, said, get out of there, you've only got 15 minutes of juice left, and get into the lunar module. Power it up to save the command module systems, because this baby is the only one that can get you back to Earth alive. The lunar module is never intended to land on Earth. It's a fragile aluminum vehicle. It'll burn up.
One of the things that confuses me, Jules, they have to come back through the atmosphere in the command module, obviously, but you were saying before that the bulk oxygen supply now is coming from LEM, right? Into the module?
Right.
All right. If it's coming from there, and yet they have to jettison LEM before they come back into Earth, what do they do about oxygen for that period?
I should have explained that. Okay, remember now, both vehicles are docked together, and they'll continue to stay docked almost until reaching the Earth. All right. The one significant thing, and Jim Lovell and Fred Hayes and Swigert were all cool cookies, and they saved their own lives with one instinctive act. They immediately pressurized what are called the surge and emergency oxygen tanks aboard the command module. That's the get-me-home oxygen. Without it, I'm dead. With it, I've got enough oxygen for 6 or 7 hours of flight to re-enter in. So they'll fly along this way until shortly before re-entering the Earth's atmosphere, then transfer out of the LEM, jettison the LEM. It's done its job, but it will save their lives at that point. They'll jettison the service module, which is useless to them, and re-enter a conventional Apollo moon-Earth re-entry type thing. Re-enter over the Pacific, we hope, though the issue still is not resolved, and hopefully come down to a safe landing. We've gotten word from Mission Control that it's about 15 minutes away from the small burn of the...
How critical is that burn going to be, Jules? Is it absolutely essential that they get into that 60-mile orbit?
Oh, yes. Otherwise, they'd be so far out, they'd run out of oxygen before anything else could be done. And the reason it's being done now, shortly before you came in while you were racing on the Parkway to get here, Jim, the original intent was to do it tomorrow night. But here's what happened. And Chris Kraft believes in conservative, real-time flight planning. And he's got some marvelous troops down there in Mission Control who know that game. They were supposed to do that burn at 9:30 tomorrow night. But how long will my systems hold up? Supposing we begin to lose more oxygen? This, as I call it, is the get-me-home burn. By doing it now, I guarantee I'm going to get back no matter what happens. There's no